I am Michella Marino, and I am the author of Roller Derby, The History of an American Sport. I am a Hoosier at heart, so I of course grew up playing basketball at a small school southeast of Indianapolis, and always loved basketball throughout my whole life. And by the time I got to my doctoral program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, I knew I wanted to study basketball somehow for my dissertation. But I had an advisor, Chris Oppie, and he gave me some wise advice. I distinctly remember this meeting where he wanted me to look into a comparative sport. So if we're going to do this very traditional, long, historical sport of basketball, like maybe something else that wasn't so traditional. And so there was this moment where he was like, "What about roller derby?" And I was like, "What about roller derby?" Like, I didn't have really any frame of reference for it. And he, had just sort of said it's sort of back lately. It's got a lot of really interesting gender dynamics that you could look into. And so I did. I started studying it and fell in love with it and then began playing it. I started researching roller derby then in my doctoral program and then turned it into a full-length manuscript years later. So roller derby is a really fascinating case study because there's all these intersections between gender, between race, between class. It explores sort of a different avenue of sports, unlike traditional sports. Again, I think where this book is unique is because it does this deep dive into parenthood, which is not something that has traditionally been included in really women's sports, but even men's sports throughout the 20th century and 21st centuries. So roller derby provides this really unique lens to explore all these really interesting dynamics that I don't think really have been parceled out much, particularly in the long history of women's sports. For a long time, people haven't taken the sport of roller derby seriously. They compared it to, wrestling. They thought it was fake. They thought it was staged. And there have been moments throughout its history where it definitely was on a sliding scale of legitimacy or legitimate or not. They would often stage plays. They would do have intentional fights to get the crowd riled up. Through a big chunk of its history, roller derby was an actual sport, or at least, at the very least, whether the winning or losing the games actually mattered is sort of irrelevant. But these are athletes that are professional athletes that are trained, that are traveling across the United States and even internationally. But because women played the sport on par with men since its inception in 1935, people just didn't take it seriously. What did it mean if there was this professional woman athlete in 1950 who was knocking the crap out of everybody on the track? What did that mean for women in the mid-20th century? What did that mean for sports if women could compete on par and in fact be teammates with men? That sort of blew up the whole sporting model through much of the 20th century and even into the 21st, so people didn't know what to do with it. So women's sports have really progressed over the course of the 20th century and then into the 21st. Of course, there's been a lot of changes with Title IX in 1972. But to say that things are equal today is just laughable. It certainly is not the case. And we're still unpacking a lot of these gender dynamics that I explore in the book. What happens after you have a baby? When can you come back? Women are not paid the same. I'm sure there'll be lots of exciting conversations coming up about the Women's World Cup with soccer, sports and the Olympics, and gosh, there's so many different things we could talk about. But while great strides have been made, I don't think, especially if you look at how media coverage exists on women's sports and also attendance at games, it's not equal. And there's a lot of reasons for why that is the case. And that would be a 5-hour conversation that we could have another time. But I also do find hope. So for instance, I have a 9-year-old son and he is equally excited to go to the Fever and watch them play as he is to the Pacers. So I think there is a younger generation where sports for anyone are normalized, and that's a good thing, but we still have a lot of work to do. Men and women knocking the crap out of each other, what's not to like about that, right? But what I would say is that it really blows up gender roles and gender norms when you're looking at the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. So if you're just interested in seeing this sort of pushback to what we think normal people's lives were like in the 20th century, roller derby just shatters that in a lot of ways. And so I think it's an interesting exploration of we're told that this is how things were. This is what the sports world looked like. And that really isn't true. And it was actually very popular. So I think it gives you a glimpse inside a world that at once was popular and everybody knew about it, but nobody has talked about for a really long time. So whether you're a sports fan or just, interested in looking at, pop culture references, or countercultural type things, like there's a little bit for everybody. Well, I am a historian by training, so of course I love Jim Madison's work on Indiana history, and also Emmylou Thornborough, who writes about Black history in Indiana, but also a variety of other topics too. But I also secretly love reading teen fiction, so John Green, of course.